All right, welcome back to the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta, and today we're going to be talking about the recent news, sort of underreported in my opinion, of the U.S. agreement with Iraq to withdraw forces from Iraq proper. And that'll lead us to a larger discussion about U.S. forces in the Middle East in general. And then we'll also talk about how do I resist my type A tendencies. Now, don't get me wrong, I am a type A, and sometimes being type A is good, but sometimes it can get in the way. So we'll talk a little bit about how do I watch out for that, right? As always, you can like and follow me on Instagram and YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor, and get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We'll jump right in. Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta. And in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions, harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. So probably underreported in my opinion in the news and a little bit confusing for a lot of reasons, but the U.S. and Iraq, the Iraqi government, have reached a tentative agreement to withdraw the majority of the last of U.S. forces from Iraq. So going all the way back to 2003 invasion, even further back than that, but 2003 invasion of Iraq, the United States has had combat forces in Iraq. And most recently, we've had about 2,500, give or take, forces in Iraq proper, largely functioning as advisors to the Iraqi military. But then recently, the U.S. conducted a joint raid with Iraqi forces. So, even though they're advisors, there are actually some combat actions ongoing. Additionally, you have U.S. troops flying cover for U.S. forces, U.S. Air Force and Navy aircraft, for example, flying cover missions for these sorts of missions. So, the idea that there's not combat troops in Iraq is a little bit of a misnomer, in my opinion. But nevertheless, the Iraqi government and the U.S. have reached some sort of loose agreement. Timeline is TBD, but roughly 2025 or maybe 2026, depending on which news source you're reading. And essentially, it will withdraw the last of those, or the majority of the last of those 2,500, with some small remnant, would be my guess, remaining in the embassy or remaining as advisors. And really, the U.S. forces not conducting combat operations inside Iraq. Now, that begs the larger question, well, where are U.S. forces in the Middle East? And hey, that's a great question. And as part of this agreement, the U.S. announced that it will leave combat forces or U.S. security forces, depending on how you call them, in places like Syria, which is also interesting that, hey, we have troops in Syria? Yeah, we do. So, it's kind of, I think, surprising. In fact, a while back at the presidential debate, Vice President Harris said that, she's happy to announce that there are no U.S. forces in combat in anywhere in the world, which, depending on how you scale combat, I think some of the folks that were on the ground in Iraq might disagree with how they call that, or Syria, how they call combat, right? But definitions, words mean things, so I'm not going to hold that against her too much. But what that begs the larger question is, like, what are U.S. forces up to in the Middle East? Where are they? So this little map, courtesy of the New York Times, shows us some of the locations that the U.S. has been operating in. And for those of you just listening, what this shows is just the series of bases in and around the Middle East. And so primarily U.S. forces are on the Arabian Peninsula, in places like Qatar and UAE and Kuwait. We have bases also in Oman and in Saudi Arabia, as well as in Jordan, and then the aforementioned forces in Iraq and Syria. So we have these sort of outposts of U.S. forces of various sizes on the ground in the Middle East in various places. Obviously, since the withdrawal from Afghanistan, there are no more forces there. But then, we have also forces in parts of Iraq, Africa, specifically in Djibouti, and then in parts of Turkey. And so there are, and give or take, around, again, depending on what news you read and who's given the estimate, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 U.S. troops in and or around the Middle East. That also includes sort of an ongoing naval presence. So the U.S. periodically sorties Navy task forces, primarily carrier task forces, through the Middle East. And they've been on station in the Middle East for the better part of the 20th and 21st century, frankly. But also you see U.S. naval task forces, including carrier task forces, approaching the Middle East from the Mediterranean. And so those, in fact, are two different naval commands, but just as a gee whiz, but they both have access to sort of the same territory through either Israel or through Saudi Arabia. So in that way, depending on how you count and who you're counting and what command they live under and those kind of things, right, there may be more or less than 40,000 troops. So what are they up to? Any number of things, right? During as the conflict between Iran and Israel has been escalating, there's both a deterrent mission and a defense mission to defend Israel and other parts of the Middle East from attack. Right. Additionally, the naval forces in particular are intervening to protect shipping into the Red Sea, through the Bab el-Mandeb down there along the Yemeni coast, where we've seen attacks there. Then also the U.S. Navy protects shipping of all types that goes through the Straits of Hormuz along the Iranian UAE Omani border, but in the waters between those two nations. So needless to say, the military is busy in the Middle East. Besides conducting these raids and advising in Iraq, they're also doing security and anti-ISIS missions in Syria. They're protecting shipping in the Red Sea and through the Straits of Hormuz, and they're deterring Iranian aggression. And they're securing securing our interests, as it were, in the Middle East, and also training with our friends and allies in the region. So that's a lot of things that we've been up to, but I think most people would find it surprising that there are that many forces scattered in that many places about the Middle East. And now you know. As always, you can like and follow me on Instagram and YouTube. Shoot your questions there at the Fighter Pilot Professor, as well as you can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts. All right, so raise your hand if you are a Type A personality. And what does it mean to be a Type A person? So Type A persons are driven. They are usually tending towards perfectionism, sort of as we talked about last time. They are typically seen as hardworking. Some people may say that they're a bit overbearing, nay, verily bossy. They are direct. They tend to speak their mind, etc. And all of those things, I think, are true. And in most cases, I think most of those personality traits are helpful. Especially in a business like being a fighter pilot. Fighter pilots strive to be really good at our job. We are driven to do well. We are motivated to do well because, the cost of not doing well is very steep in our business. Similarly, we prize direct communication. We often debrief each other in very direct, and some would say harsh ways, in order to get better at our profession, right? And so, frankly, a lot of fighter pilots and other aircrew are Type A personalities, right? But that is not always the best way to operate, frankly, right? And it can also, if you are a type A person dealing with people that are not type A, can lead to a lot of frustration, particularly if you are working on a team or leading a team, and some of those people are less driven. And not to say that they're not successful or whatever, but they're just less driven or less perfectionist or less in charge or less direct than you are. It can be very frustrating. And so how do I overcome my type A tendencies in order to be a good team player? Because you have to be a good team player if you're on a team. Or how do I be a good boss? I can't just like go around yelling at people for not doing their job right? Most of the people that I work with in academia would not appreciate my fighter pilot debrief style. Shockingly, I know, but it is how it is, right? So how do I sort of mellow out my type A tendencies in the worst way, the worst parts of my type A tendencies, but keeping the best parts of my type A tendencies, right? So one thing I can say is like never always do your best, right? So like don't give up doing your best just because others around you are not doing their best, right? I mean, you have to recognize that, hey, if you are good at something, not everybody else is good at that thing, right? Not everybody is going to process information as quickly as you are. Not everybody is going to see the world in the same way that you do. And so you have to just sort of expand your horizon on what people can do, what people think, how they operate, etc., right? And figure out ways to maximize that version of them, right? So, helping them if need be, but often just working with them to understand the way that they do business, right? And accounting for that, right? So if you're relying on these other folks in a team or other people to deliver a product to you or whatever that is, right? Then you have to account for their style of work and potentially, right, constrain or restrain their efforts in some way in order to make sure that you are meeting your goals. And this will minimize your frustration, right? Because in the end, as a type A personality, what you're trying to do is meet the goal, win the day, etc., right? And these other people are just getting in my way, right? But if I can define for them what it is that I need, or I can tell them how I can help or whatever, then maybe that will decrease some of your frustration, right? The second thing is, especially if you're a leader of a team, is that, not everybody appreciates direct feedback. And we've talked about the importance of giving feedback and getting feedback and mentorship and all that kind of thing in previous episodes, so I'm not going to delve too deep into it, right? But not everybody out there appreciates direct feedback, frankly. And so I would say that you have to sort of gauge the situation of like how difficult or how harsh or how direct can I be with my feedback with this particular person. And it's not to say that people don't need direct feedback, but I can always couch it in a way that is a little less harsh. So I don't need to be like, hey, you suck, get better, but I can phrase that differently. Hey, I really would appreciate it if you would focus your efforts on this thing. I've noticed that this thing has been a little less than up to standard recently, and so I need you to focus in on making that thing better, whatever that thing is, right? So you can sort of restrain and constrain your own best intentions, right, when giving feedback and making sure that you're delivering the message in a way that's palatable to people that are not as open to direct feedback, right? Even type A people sometimes are not open to direct feedback. They like to speak directly to others, but they're not necessarily open directly to themselves. So you have to figure out how to sort of navigate with them as well. And the last thing I'll say is, no matter if you're on a team or leading a team, is remember that, hey, you're not always right. Shocker, I know, right? Type A folks like me often think we are right, and we usually are, but not always. And just because you process information quickly doesn't mean that you've processed the information correctly. And so you may be just blazing away with your good ideas and all of the things that you know about what's going on, and you may be way off base, right? And I am here to tell you that there are a lot of smart people out there that are hesitant to speak up if somebody else is doing the talking. So just know that you may not be the smartest person in the room. And so give other people a chance to sort of work through the issues, problems, etc. on their own. Give them a space to talk. Don't dominate the conversation if you don't have to, right? Especially as a leader, you can dominate the conversation as a leader just by the sake of your position. And so if you're dominating the conversation, you're squashing potentially good ideas out there, even when you're way off base. So I hope that helps you constrain your type A personalities out there. Sorry to break it to you, but you're not always right. Most of the time you are, though. All right, keep following me, liking me on Instagram and YouTube, The Fighter Pilot Professor. Listen to the podcast wherever you get your podcast, and sending me your questions. Have a good one.